On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
his head could be seen to move violently forward.
And
they took the babies out of the incubators.
And
mobile production facilities.
And
the rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit paranoid tinfoil dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
I'm David Korn, the Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones Magazine, and I'm a blogger for CQ.com, and we're here tonight talking about Matt's new book, which is a mouthful, The Great Derangement, a terrifying true story of war, politics, and religion at the twilight of the American Empire.
I had nothing to do with that subhead, by the way.
Oh, Chris Jackson, the editor. I've worked with Chris in the past. So, you know, unlike some of your interviewers, I've read the book. And if I have it right, let me ask you this. Your thesis is that the American government... Yeah, well, you call it a theory. I'll call it a thesis. Is that the American government has increasingly become an enterprise built on deception, self-interest, screwing not the few but the many and serving the few, and that after 9/11 it's become even more so at a time when perhaps Americans would even like it to be less so, and that as a result of this continuation of a process, Americans are tuning out, but not just tuning out, but they're turning to either Christian end times fundamentalist religion, nonsense, or 9/11 conspiracy theory, nonsense, which you equate, you know, as equivalents, and that this is the great derangement of which you speak, that America is just going in these two similar but different directions. And my question is, do you really believe that? I mean, is it really?
It was necessary in order to make all the disparate parts of the book fit together.
Well,
for
that's
me to believe
kind
that.
of, you know, as an editor and as a writer, I'm kind of, you know, looking for the seams. But I mean, it's a pretty bold statement. The book is basically reporting, and you're reporting on the time you spent with John Hagee's fundamentalist church in San Antonio, and we'll get into specifics about that, and your encounters with 9/11 truth, the 9/11 truth movement, which, if you haven't heard of it, are people who believe either the Bush administration caused 9/11 so they can take advantage of it, or
It's called MyHop, by the way, made it happen on purpose.
or LIHOP,
MyHop,
they let it happen on purpose so they could exploit it. So so you start with a bold idea, Americans are tuning out, but this is, you know, the result. And so the question is, are Americans that crazy?
Well, in some cases, yeah, you know, and I mean, I think it's really sad. I mean,
the reason I pointed that out is on economic and Wall Street issues and banking issues, Matt Taibbi is very sharp. I won't comment similarly on David Korn. And it's entirely possible that people with a science background, which I do have, and some of you do have, find it easier to examine data independent of prejudice. It's also one of the reasons I played Corbett's thing. It is obviously sarcastic and sardonic, but it lays out what a person has to embrace if you're going to embrace the governance theory. There are three basic theories of history. Any event in history. It's either a coincidence, it's either a lone nut acting to effect an event, or it's a conspiracy. No, either nobody was involved, one person was involved, or several people were involved. If someone can logically come up with a fourth alternative, I invite you to. I can't. So, with that premise, what the government has told the American people is a conspiracy theory, by definition. So, in terms of logic, if you're going to compare conspiracy theory A with conspiracy theory B with conspiracy theory C, you've got to look at the relative probabilities of the effectiveness of the motive, the presence of a method, and the presence of an opportunity. Method of the three elements: motive, means, and opportunity. That's what constitutes a crime. So I've come to the conclusion, and this is a very tentative one, and I invite alternative suggestions. It is obvious to me that the vast majority of academicians in the United States have decided they'd rather hold on to their jobs than speak what is obvious to them. And it's obvious to me, it's apparent, I shouldn't say obvious, it's apparent to me that David Corn would rather maintain his standing as a quintessential liberal on American media than say, you know, I wonder if there's an alternative explanation. Because it's clear that in terms of the media pressure, in terms of public opinion, you're not only a pedophile and a potential murderer, you are also an asshole and stupid if you believe an alternative conspiracy theory. That is an exceedingly powerful motivation for keeping one's mouth shut. Indeed, if I were in journalism, rather than having worked in anesthesia, it would be, especially if I had a family and children to support, it would be almost insurmountable pressure to keep my mouth shut, even if I had come to an alternative conclusion. And one of the reasons I'm going over this with you, you guys don't need to be convinced of any of this. I'm wondering very much if this isn't exactly what played itself out in the 1930s in Germany. The last time we had mass hysteria following an ideology that was popular but made no sense whatsoever, and everybody with influence embraced it. Look at the social pressure of going along with the group. I think it was Goebbels who said that if you're going to lie, make it a big lie and repeat it often. And it sooner or later becomes the truth. This leads me to another topic. And if I'm less than organized, or less than usually organized today, it's because there are several things I want to accomplish. It's obvious to everyone in this room that the public media, whether we're talking about print or television or radio, the media has been lying to you about at least some things. We were lied to about Pearl Harbor. We were lied to about Vietnam multiple times. We were easily lied to about Iraq. The question is whether that condition of public manipulation is a constant reality or is it an increasingly evident reality. And I would submit that especially since 9/11, and especially even more so since the election of Donald Trump, it is becoming increasingly important to wedge the American population into moving in a specific direction. Everyone had to get on board with the Iraq War, in spite of the fact that 25 million people around the world went into the streets of their cities objecting to the American invasion of Iraq. Didn't stop the invasion. In fact, that very fact probably killed whatever peace movement was already around, because they gave it their very best shot, and it didn't accomplish anything. But since 9/11, and especially since the election of Donald Trump, it seems to me that the media is progressively hysterical to get you to follow. And I want to point out about a couple of relatively recent events. It was very important for the media in particular, and whoever is behind the media, to bully Donald Trump. Donald Trump, quite accurately, observed about the Charlottesville violence that both sides were itching for a fight, and both sides bore responsibility for the violence that did occur. Historically and analytically, dead right on. An absolutely unacceptable interpretation of the facts, at least according to the media, at least according to the myth and legend that was being crammed down the throats of the American people. Likewise, I don't know what happened in Las Vegas, but I know with considerable confidence that the story you and I were told about a lone gunman shooting in excess of 500 people and killing 58, at least some of those facts are dead wrong. You don't have mountains of empty cartridges aside the corpse of the guy who supposedly did it. You've got sound recordings that indicate gunfire from at least 2 different directions. You've got video recordings that indicate gunfire from at least 2 different directions. You don't have anybody dying after the event. With 500 people wounded, you would have newspaper reports of people dying over the next 2 weeks. Didn't see a single one. Catherine?
Except for witnesses who said that there were multiple shooters. They've been dying.
That doesn't surprise me. I hadn't been aware of that particular fact, but whatever the story really is, I can guarantee you that the story that you have been spoon-fed ain't so. And I get the distinct impression that somebody is very concerned, and I think it started when the same somebody or somebodies became aware that the story that they were feeding the American people was not being swallowed properly. When Donald Trump was elected, however accidentally, because he was elected by very clever manipulation of the voting patterns, specifically in Ohio and in Wisconsin. He said exactly the right things in Ohio and Wisconsin to shift a few percentage of people. But the very fact that it was that close, I think, scared the badickens out of some people. They realized that they no longer were in as complete control of the American mind as they thought they were. And I think that's one of the reasons that you're seeing this hysteria about moving in this direction. You can't move in that direction, you can't move in that direction, or you are what? You're a neo-Nazi. You're a domestic extremist. You are an outsider. Terrible crime to be guilty of being an outsider. I think there are several, and I wanted to share this with you before we get on to some historical elements. One of the goals of this recent hysteria clearly is to disempower Trump. He now is totally castrated, at least politically and perhaps in other ways as well. Another is to disparage real news sources. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the Harvard Library has come out with a list of fake news sources. And you look over that list of fake news sources, and a good number of them are reliable news sources, like, The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Information Clearinghouse, What Really Happened, Who, What, Why, any of a number, the Duran. Interestingly enough, and I think I can explain this, the World Socialist website is not on that forbidden list. And I think the one reason WSWS did not get on it is they don't even want to call attention to it. Google is being manipulated so that when you do a search for a certain item and World Socialist website has a piece on that item, Google doesn't pick that up. even though WSWS is one of the better websites for alternative information. On the other hand, Truthout, which is a tax-exempt organization, isn't on the list either. And I think I can explain that because Truthout has recently got on the bandwagon about identity politics. And to my considerable sadness, I no longer have Truthout on my list of relatively reliable sources. A third goal in this recent hysteria I share with you is to increase factionalism. I mentioned neo-Nazis or white supremacists. That's one of the labels that is being tossed around precisely in order to make people who want the United States to be a sovereign state, not who want it to be one of the managers of the global world, but want the United States to be run as if it were for the benefit of the United States people. What a radical idea. Currently, the United States government is not being run for the 99%. Hope that's not news to anybody, but it's being run for the people who control. And we're going to get into a little history. At the Constitutional Convention, the bold assertion was made that the country should be run by the people who own it. Well, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, today the country is run by and for the people who own it. And as that one comedian said, it's a big club, and you ain't in it, neither am I. And I think the fourth goal is to get the American people ready for something. And what it is, I'm not sure. It might be another false flag, like 9/11. It might be a push for a constitutional convention. Henry Kissinger said, we can create the conditions, and they might be in the process of doing it. We can create the conditions where the American people will not accept martial law, they will demand it. Things like Las Vegas can easily be used to move the herd toward demanding things like martial law, preemptive restraint, preemptive confinement. This tragic young man who we are told killed 8 people in New York. I strongly suspect that in the discussion in the next week, 2 weeks or so, there's going to be the question, since the FBI was aware of this gentleman, why wasn't he confined, why wasn't he detained before he committed the crime? They're doing it in Israel nowadays anyway. It's going to happen in Europe, and preemptive confinement is one of the methods that is going to be proposed for limiting this kind of tragic violence. With that, kind of as forerunner, I want to present, we've already talked about the power centers in this group in the past, but I want to, come on, that word has to decide to come up. I hadn't started the program. You here are already aware of the 7 major economic power centers in the United States. Military-industrial complex, oil, coal, metals, the extraction industry. Agribusiness, where groups like ADM and Cargill are basically turning farmers into employees because of the contractual arrangements they have with the farmers about using their seed and their weed killer, et cetera, et cetera. Big Pharma and the allied medical institutions the entertainment industry that determines not only what you tend to believe, but also what is politically acceptable and unacceptable. One reason Trump is totally unacceptable, besides his tragically big mouth, is he has been decided to be unacceptable by people in the entertainment and communications industry. The Israel lobby in all of its manifestations. I submitted a letter to the editor, which almost certainly will not be printed, but keep an eye out for it anyway, because Wisconsin became the 24th state to enact, in this case by governor's decree, that the state of Wisconsin is not allowed to do business with any business that supports and or participates in the BDS movement against Israel. Meaning the government of Wisconsin is not allowed to do business with a seller of equipment if that seller of equipment is participating in the BDS movement against Israel. Meaning that anyone who participates in the BDS movement automatically loses exposure and contact with one of the biggest buyers in the state of Wisconsin. Such an activity, such a governmental action is already in force in our federal government. And in my letter to the editor, I said, why are we beating the bushes so much to find out about foreign governments interfering with American domestic policy? All we have to do is look at the standing ovations that Benjamin Netanyahu gets, and we don't have to wonder whether foreign governments are interfering with American domestic policy. We'll see if that gets published. Big banks and the rest of the fire sector, and let me describe it this way. Big banks, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Treasury have revolving doors. So that someone who works for the Treasury, his next job might be in the Federal Reserve, or it might be at Goldman Sachs. But there's a revolving door, and there's a cooperative arrangement that I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. If that happens with the SEC, Treasury, the Federal Reserve System, and Goldman Sachs, you can be sure that it also happens with the CDC and Big Pharma. You can be sure that it happens with the Department of the Interior and the extraction industry. You can be absolutely certain that it happens in the military and retiring generals going to work for Boeing or Lockheed. That revolving door is one of the major sources of the corruption that Matt Taibbi rightly writes about in the federal government. This kind of corruption has been with us for a long time, and although it has gotten worse, it has not changed in its character. Something else has happened since the administration of George W. Bush. And it probably started covertly in the administration of Bill Clinton. And it's gaining more and more influence, and that's why I want to call your attention to it, because if American policy is becoming more and more unhinged from realistic interactions with other nations. Realistic foreign policy needs to have an accurate and faithful understanding of the interests of Russia and the capabilities of Russia, the national interests of North Korea and the capabilities of North Korea, the interests of Venezuela and the natural abilities to resist and or comply that Venezuela has. Specifically, since 9/11, American foreign policy has been geared not only to advance American industrial interests, be it the military-industrial complex, be it the extraction industry, specifically oil. It's also been managed specifically to advance the interests of Israel. That is tragically obvious. What is not yet as obvious is that it is progressively unhinged from a realistic understanding of Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Yemen, or Israel, or Lebanon. It's become progressively ideological, so that instead of looking at these entities and saying, what can reasonably be done with our abilities and their interests and their interests and our abilities? There's no connection. As an example, North Korea is in a position, if the United States attacks North Korea, to kill tens of thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of South Koreans, and the United States military couldn't do a thing about it. And I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. I'm just talking about the ability of North Korea to devastate the area around Seoul, South Korea. Yet the American government is talking, and it's obviously worse with Donald Trump's administration, but it was evident earlier as well. It is unhinged. It is unhinged in exactly the same way that a bully believes in his omnipotence is unhinged. Because sometimes a bully runs into someone who is a lot smaller than him, but knows jujitsu and karate. And for better or for worse, the government of North Korea knows both jujitsu and karate. That's just the reality. That's a small country. We've been saying things about Russia, where Russia's ability to defend itself is 4 generations ahead of the United States' ability to attack Russia. Now, I'm talking about Russia defending herself, not attacking. Russia has no intention of attacking Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, much less Poland or the United States. Interestingly enough, a Pentagon private briefing described perfectly what Putin and Putin's government wants for Russia and the world. Russia wants a multipolar world with recognition and respect for national boundaries and cooperation, economic and political cooperation between sovereign nation states. The Pentagon recognizes that that is Putin's goal and attack that program because it's not sufficiently subservient to the superpower of the United States. I would submit to you that that is not only egocentric, it is unhinged from anything that is real. And I'm disgusted with this kind of multipolar corruption from the 7 power centers, economic power centers. I'm much more concerned about the irrationality of the neoconservatives who are dominating the American government right now, because they seem to be unhinged from reality. Boeing is not unhinged from reality. Cargill is not unhinged from reality. When Monsanto discovered that they weren't going to be able to sell GMOs, they backed off. I haven't seen the neoconservatives back off 1 inch from what appears to be a crazy program. Okay, not for that. History in class. I want to show you a number of things. I want you to recognize that the neoconservatives are superimposed on these 7 rational power centers. They exist in the big banks, they clearly exist in the Israel lobby, They clearly exist in the media entertainment section, and they clearly exist in the military-industrial complex. They exist in the extraction industry because they found oil on the Golan Heights. Agribusiness and big pharma, probably not. But they seem to be superimposed on this. Now, with that in mind, I want to play you a few videos. Come on, let's go here now. I'm going to have Mike Parenti talk to us. I'll only have him talk for 10 minutes, though.
This is Michael Parenti, and welcome to Real History, a series of talks by me on different subjects in history that are relevant to today's realities. Most people are never exposed to real history. In school, we usually don't even read history. We read history textbooks, mainstream ones that avoid the underlying realities and propagate all sorts of myths that serve the powers that be. Myths that are not very useful, in fact harmful to those of us who might want to believe in truth and in democracy. This particular segment of Real History is entitled The Myths of the Founding Fathers. As we were taught in school, a group of dedicated leaders of our young nation, called our Founding Fathers, met in Philadelphia in 1787 to build a nation and to write the Constitution. The United States of that time has been described as an egalitarian society. It was supposedly free from the extremes of want and wealth that characterized the feudal old world. But in fact, there were landed estates and there were colonial mansions that were really quite impressive and demonstrated a most impressive accumulation of wealth. From the earliest English settlements, the men of influence received vast land grants from the British Crown. By 1700, 3/4 of the acreage in New York State belonged to fewer than a dozen persons. By 1760, fewer than 500 men in 5 colonial cities controlled most of the commerce, the banking, the mining, the manufacturing, and most of the newspapers and journals on the eastern seaboard, and they owned most of the land. This was hardly your egalitarian middle-class society. As of 1787, property qualifications left perhaps more than a third of the white male population disfranchised. Property qualifications for holding office were so steep that most voters could not even qualify as candidates. Thus, a member of the New Jersey legislature had to be worth about £1,000 free of debt even to run for office. There also were no secret ballots. The men who got together in Philadelphia to frame the Constitution were financially successful planters, slaveholders, merchants, creditors, bankers, and manufacturers. Who else can take 4.5 months off to go sit in Philadelphia and write the Constitution? Many of them were linked to each other by kinship and marriage, and by years of service in Congress or the military or diplomatic service. And they had 3 things they wanted to do. They wanted to build a stronger central government to deal better with the conditions of trade and industry within 13 states. They also wanted to build a stronger central government to deal better with other nations. But there was a third reason. It's the one that the historians who don't want to bother with real history never talk about. The framers of the Constitution were very troubled with the increasingly insurgent spirit, rebellious spirit among the common population. There were attempts to take over state governments, there was broad agitation, and the wealthy class looked to a national government as a means of protecting their interests, as a means of building a stronger mechanism of national control. Most historians say very little about the actual plight of the common people in that time. Most of the agrarian population, and about 85% of Americans in 1787 lived in the agrarian sector, most of them consisted of small farmers, tenants, or indentured servants. Indentured servants were white people who were in indenture, that is, they were in conditions of servitude. It wasn't quite slavery because it was for a fixed time and they could get out eventually. They could work their way out. These people were burdened by heavy rents, ruinous taxes, and low incomes. To survive, they frequently had to borrow money at very high interest rates. To pay their debts, they mortgaged their future crops. When you mortgage your future crop, you go still deeper into debt. So large numbers of them were caught in that cycle of rural indebtedness, which is today still the common fate of many agrarian peoples in many countries who are in the grip of the moneyed interests.
And it was
Throughout
also
this
the case in
period, by the way, newspapers
1929.
complained of, quote, increasing numbers of young beggars in the streets. Economic prisoners crowded the jails. Many were incarcerated for debts or non-payment of taxes. And among the American people, there grew the feeling that the revolution against the English crown had been fought for no good reason. Disorders of a violent but organized kind occurred in a number of states. In the winter of 1787, the most dramatic disorder was when debtor farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, took up arms. But their rebellion was crushed by the state militia after several skirmishes. They left exactly 11 men dead and scores wounded. When the founding fathers, so-called founding fathers, met in Philadelphia, they were determined that persons of birth and fortune and affluence should control the affairs of the nation and check what they call the leveling impulses of the propertyless multitude that composed what Madison called the majority faction. James Madison, who played probably the most crucial role in the Constitution, putting the Constitution together, talked about how it was important in his famous Federalist Paper number 10, how it was important to keep the spirit and form of popular government with only a minimum of the substance. How do you construct a government? This was the task, he said, that the framers were facing. How do you construct a government that would win some popular support but would not tamper with the existing class structure? A government strong enough to service the growing needs of an entrepreneurial class while withstanding the democratic egalitarian demands of the popular class. And the way you do it is by excluding the popular class from most of the crucial points of power. The framers all agreed with Madison when he wrote in his Federalist number 10 that, quote, the most common and durable source of faction, and by faction he meant class whenever he used the word faction, the most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Now, if you say that today, you're called a Marxist. Well, Madison was talking about reality, and we can't help but have certain forms of reality on Marxists. The first object of government, Madison went on, is the protection of different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. Elbridge Gerry, another one of the framers in Philadelphia, noted that democracy was the worst of all political evils. Both he and Madison warned of the danger of the leveling spirit. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, another delegate to Philadelphia, the people should have as little to do as may be about the government. Alexander Hamilton, of course, all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and the well-born, the other are the mass of the people. And the people are turbulent and changing, they seldom judge or determine right. So these delegates were rather explicit that the further you could keep people from government, the better. Now they spent many weeks debating their interests, and most of the historical accounts about the founding fathers is about these differences, the differences between merchants and slave owners and manufacturers, the debate between the northerners and the southerners. But this was a debate of haves versus haves, in which each group sought to safeguard its own interests. And it involved mostly questions of representation and structure. On these issues, there were no dirt farmers or poor artisans attending the convention to offer an opposing view. They couldn't take 4 months off to go to Philadelphia. And for the most part, the framers built a constitution that would have the power to support commerce and protect the interests of property in a variety of ways. Lay and collect taxes, establish a national currency, fix imports and duties, and the like. Set up uniform laws on bankruptcy, pay the debts, and so forth. Some of the delegates, for instance, were land speculators, and they expressed a real concern about Western holdings and dealing with the Indian tribes. And so Congress was given, quote, the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. That's right from our Constitution. In other words, to deal with the territories and the Indians. Some delegates speculated very highly in inflated and nearly worthless securities that had been floated under the Articles of Confederation. Well, under Article 6, all debts that had been incurred under the Confederation were now valid against the new government, and this allowed speculators to make enormous profits because they bought these securities, for pittance, and now they were being refunded and honored at face value. So they made quite a killing for themselves. In the interest of these merchants and creditors, the states were prohibited from issuing paper money or imposing duties on imports and exports or interfering with the payment of debts. There was another form of property that was mentioned in the Constitution, a very important one, and it was afforded a special accommodation: slavery, the property of other human beings. They were never called slaves. They would say persons in bondage and bondage and such, and persons in servitude. They were never called slaves in the Constitution, but that's what they were. The importation of slaves was given constitutional protection for about 20 years, another 20 years. Slaves who escaped from one state to another had to be delivered up to the original owner upon claim. This was a provision that was unanimously adopted in the convention. The framers were also worried about rebellions by workers and such. And would the state militias prove reliable as the working class grew in numbers? And by the way, they anticipated a day when the mass of the people would be working, not on their own land, but working as employees. Well, Congress was given the task of, quote, organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and calling it forth to suppress insurrections. Those are quotes right from the Constitution. And by the way, that was a provision that was to prove a godsend for the industrial barons a century later in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, when the army was used repeatedly to break strikes by miners and railroad workers and factory workers. The method of representation was interesting. Nobody could vote for the president. The chief executive was to be selected by an electoral college that was voted by the people. But the framers anticipated that these meetings of the electoral college in each of the various states would consist of political leaders and men of substance. Again, who would be able to travel to the state capital and sit there and debate who should be president. They'd gather in their various states and they would choose a president of their own liking. So the electoral college was set up as a kind of filter against popular sentiment. The Senate could not be elected. The Senate was picked by the state legislatures rather than directly elected by the people. The senators were not elected by the people until the 20th century. The Supreme Court, which could have final say over the constitutionality of laws, was elected by no one. Its justices were appointed to life tenure by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So you had a very elaborate structure up there that was far removed from the popular will. The only portion of government that was directly elected by the people was the House of Representatives, and even that took something of an argument to get through. It took a number of people. The delegates finally agreed to having the people elect the lower house. But when they talked about the people, by the way, when they talked about the people, they were referring to a select portion of the population. As I said, property qualifications disfranchised the poorest white males in various states. There were all sorts of other ways of disfranchising would-be voters. Literacy tests, inaccessibility of voting. You have to go 10, 15 miles on a horse and wagon to get to the county seat to vote. You were not likely to vote over those muddy roads and whatever else. Half of the adult population was denied suffrage because they were women. American Indians had no access to the ballot. About 1/4 of both men and women had no vote because they were held in bondage. And even the African Americans who had gained their legal freedom, the black people who gained their freedom in both the North and the South, which was a small portion, but none was allowed to vote until the passage of the 14th Amendment.
Perink does a good job of exposing the fact that the U.S. Constitution was written by people who had a vested interest in preserving privilege. Everyone there was privileged, some of them privileged by being in manufacturing, others by their families having been given huge land grants by the King of England, and others by virtue of holding slaves and operating large plantations. It was a convention of the one percenters. I'm not certain of the date, but I believe that no decision of the Supreme Court that was based on the Bill of Rights was made until the early part of the 20th century. The Bill of Rights was included not as an afterthought, but as a way of recruiting sufficient support from the 99% so as to acquire state approval of the new Constitution. And one of the dangers we face nowadays is the only thing protecting the common man is the Bill of Rights. Now, John Whitehead at the Rutherford Institute demonstrates that in many practical senses, the Bill of Rights no longer exists, even though the vast majority of Americans believe that it does. But on individual bases, unfortunately, the Constitution no longer means what the simple words mean. It means what 9 people who have been appointed by a president say that it means. Now, Howard Zinn is a much lauded, let's see, I want to include what Howard has to say about the Constitution as well, if I can find it. There it is. He's one of my favorite historians. Neat guy. The world lost a good man, even though I disagree with him on that stuff. He said it didn't matter who was who committed 9/11.
You can see the cobblestone circle on the island. And that's where 5 citizens of Boston were killed by the British. That's called the Boston Massacre. But today I have the opportunity to introduce Professor Howard Zinn on board with us. He is going to tell you some things about the American Revolution that you did not learn in history books. So, Professor Zinn, here is the microphone, sir.
Suppose we take a left turn here and we can talk a little about Shays' Rebellion.
Well, the American Revolution was successful in bringing classes together to some extent for the fight against England. But once that war was over, those class antagonisms began to emerge again. The peace treaty was signed in 1783. 3 years later, there was rebellion in western Massachusetts. The founding fathers became very concerned about future rebellions. When they got together in Philadelphia in 1787 to frame the Constitution of the United States, they wanted a government strong enough to put down rebellion. And so the Constitution was adopted as, you might say, a law and order document to maintain stability. With all that control, with all those enticements and diversions, the establishment has been unable to keep itself secure from revolt. Blacks rebelled. Indians, thought dead, reappeared, defiant. Working people went on strike. And young people like yourself, despite the lures of careers and comfort, have defected. Our only hope for real change lies in the possibility that all of us who are slightly privileged and slightly uneasy begin to see that we are like the guards in the prison uprising in Attica, expendable. That the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary to maintain its control, kill us. If the guards stop obeying, if you stop obeying, the system falls. If we understand that and act on it, not only will life be more satisfying today, but our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, may see a different and marvelous world.
Zen was much more of an optimist than I currently personally am. But I hope he's right. I would like to point out, let's see if I can find this. At this point, the method that was eventually arrived at for controlling the masses was education. Even at the Constitutional Convention, you had decisions being made by the haves more or less on behalf of the have-nots, with a distinct intention to preserve privilege. How do you do that? How do you do that in a country with a form of government that at least preserves the form of democracy with as little actual involvement of the people as possible? A multitude of decisions have been made in the last 100 years to include the population in actual decision making. But the point of the matter is that that was possible only as long as the multitude was able to be dragged along into thinking the way the controllers, the way the privileged wanted them to think. So I have two different ways of looking at this. And I want to show you what John Taylor Gatto says is really taught in schools today. We won't go back to the 19th century yet. But in schools today, John Taylor Gatto, who taught in the public schools, says these are what is actually taught. Be aware that in order to learn reading, a human being needs at most 3 40-hour weeks. 120 hours, a person can learn to read well in 120 hours. We go to school from year 5 to year 18, that's 13 years. You decide how many hours are involved in per year. So what else is going on? I will show you how John Taylor Gatto summarizes it, and then I'll show you how it is described by the creator of the American educational system, Mr. Inglis. That's going on. The first lesson I teach is stay in the class where you belong. I don't know who decides that my kids belong there, but that's not my business. The children are numbered so that if any get away, they can be returned to their right class. The second lesson is to turn the interest off when the bell rings, and to turn your interest on when you sit down in class after getting back into your next class. How, is this taught by somebody saying, this is what you're going to do? No. This is taught by doing it day in and day out, and week in and week out, and year in and year out. This is what typifies public schooling. The third lesson is the teacher is in charge. You surrender your will to a predestined chain of command, not unlike, by the way, the military. And the purpose of the military is to recondition the soldier to stop acting in a civilized manner and direct his aggression to a specific group instead of a general group, where Tom might take his aggression out on me one week and Russ on another week. It has to be directed towards the right group, namely the enemy. But the military is doing exactly what the school does. It is conditioning you to follow authority. The fourth lesson is, only I determine what curriculum you will study. And if you're interested in vertebrate anatomy this week, and we're supposed to be studying botany, you're out of luck, kid. Fifth lesson, how valuable you are is not determined by how your mother feels about you, how your father feels about you, or how you feel about yourself. More and more, you'd better believe that your value is determined by what I think of you. Think of how this goes on a kid from year in and year out. And the last lesson, and this is Gatto's summation, because I'm going to look at Inglis's program for secondary education. They are being watched. Closed circuit television, not only is a school kid being watched, you and I are being watched. At which point I become somewhat obscene, because if they're watching me, I'm going to do something they don't want to watch. Now, this takes a long time to inculcate. Let me, where's God? This is Gatto's. You can talk out loud.
You're not allowed to have cameras in classrooms, though.
I will, let's put it this way. If the school system wants cameras, they will have cameras. But kids will not be allowed to have cameras because they will have power then. But I can guarantee you that if the school system wants cameras, there'll be cameras in it.
Eventually. Because right now, teachers' unions and so on are allowed cameras.
Very interesting about teachers' unions. It's been known since people started learning to read that people learn better by sounding out. Remember the film Driving Miss Daisy? The chauffeur learns that Bauer starts with the bus sound and ends with the R sound. And he eventually learned how to read Bauer, and he eventually learned how to read. In the late 60s, early 70s, the educational fashion was that we will be able to teach reading more efficiently and effectively if the child learns to read the whole word. So they spent 30 or 40 years ineffectively teaching reading. It's only been and this was out on NPR very recently, that it's been recently determined by scientific methods that not only that both dyslexic children and quote normal children learn better and faster and easier if they learn how to sound out great, so that they learn the sounds associated with the individual letters. So at the minimum, fashion is involved in what the teachers teach. Worse than that is that the teachers learn how to teach and what to teach at teachers' colleges. And teachers' colleges were started by the people who want to shape the way the American student is shaped. And this is what this is kind of a reiteration, but I'll let John.
School was intended on this continent to be as it had been in northern Germany, a fifth column into the burgeoning libertarian condition where disenfranchised and oppressed groups were clamoring for some kind of seat at the bargaining table. School was to be a surgical incision into which the class-based management theories of England were to be inserted to interdict the liberty traditions.
Now I'm going to point out, he's talking about schooling, not education. George Washington educated himself in geometry, trigonometry, and surveying, independent of any teacher. So we're talking about the organized school system that was established in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century.
England's multi-layered social class is simply a modern-day representation of Julius Caesar's advice that when you're overwhelmed by the enemy, you divide them and conquer them that way by setting them against each other. The method was to be by infiltration into the minds of children, out of sight of their parents. The well-read here won't be shocked. Theorists from Plato to Rousseau to Frederick of Prussia knew and taught explicitly that if children could be kept childish beyond its term in nature, if they could be cloistered in a society of children without any real responsibility except obedience, if their inner lives could be attenuated by removing the insights of history, literature, philosophy, economics, religion, if the imminence of death and the certainty of pain and loss can be removed from daily consciousness, if the profound reflections on one's own death could be replaced with the trivializing emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, young people would grow older, but they would never grow up, and a great enduring problem of supervision would be solved. For who can argue against the truth that childish and childlike people are far easier to manage than critically trained, self-reliant ones? And now you're ready to hear the 6 purposes of modern schooling taken directly from Dr. Inglis's book. The first function of schooling is adjustive. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. That's fixed habits of reaction. Notice that this precludes critical judgment completely. Notice, too, that requiring obedience to stupid orders is a much better test of function 1 than following sensible orders ever could be. You don't know whether people are reflexively obedient unless they'll march right off the cliff. Second is the diagnostic function. School is to determine each student's proper social role, logging the evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records. You probably thought that the kid or parents or neighbors or the region, circumstances. No, school is to determine your proper social role, and they're to fix you in that role mathematically on their cumulative records. Next comes the sorting function. School sorts children by training individuals only so far as their likely destination in the social machine, not one step beyond. Keep in mind, you're not listening to John Gatto. You're listening to the man for whom the honor lecture in education at Harvard is named. The fourth function is conformity. As much as possible, kids are to be made alike. Whatever the background they come from, they're to be made alike. This is not done from any passion for egalitarian ideals, but so that their future behavior will be mathematically predictable in service to market research and government research. Next comes the hygienic function. This one's my favorite. This has nothing to do with individual health, but it has a lot to do with the health of the race, at least as Inglis or Darwin or his first cousin Galton saw it. Hygiene is a polite way of saying that school is expected to accelerate natural selection by tagging the unfit so clearly. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade on, that's what all the posted list of ranked grades are about. So clearly that the unfit will drop from the reproduction sweepstakes, either in despair or because their likely mates will have accepted the school's judgment of them as terminally inferior. And last comes a fancy Latin word, the propaidutic function. That's a fancy word meaning that a small fraction of lucky kids will quietly be taught how to take over management of this continuing project. Guardians of a population deliberately dumbed down and rendered childlike in order that government and economic life can be managed with a minimum of hassle. It's that low down, nitty-gritty, common purpose. Not Marx's grand warfare between classes and greedy
That whole program goes back to the Prussian model, Prussian schooling model, where where 0.5% of the students were taught to think contextually and critically and relationally, so that they could see the relationships between economics and politics and agriculture. They could see the interrelationship of human society. That's where it is now. Below that 0.5% in the Prussian schooling system, 5% were taught to be problem solvers, so that they were given the information necessary in a limited context so that they could solve issues of engineering or medicine or whatever. The 95% below them were taught just enough so that they could fill out the forms and fit into being a square peg in the square socket of industry. And they were not, to teach them more than that is to be inviting them to become discontented with their lot. If you read Brave New World, the Delta Minuses were grateful that they had no great responsibilities like the Betas or the Alpha Pluses. They were grateful to be able to have their Soma and to be able to go home and watch the equivalent of television. And the Alpha Pluses were grateful that they had high social standing in spite of the fact that they had to do work. Each social class in Huxley's work was happy to be in their social class. And they were taught that way when they were embryos incubating in the major bath. Huxley and Orwell wrote in the very formative period of American education in the early part of the 20th century. This, on the other hand, is what Carroll Quigley, now Quigley taught at, I'm blanking out, but one of the prestigious Eastern schools. He was teaching that 1/2%. Executive capacity can be taught, but it cannot be taught by an educational program that emphasizes knowledge in itself. The vital thing is understanding, which is knowledge that is related to other knowledge, which is related to other knowledge. It's relational thinking. This requires possession of techniques, that is, relational thinking can be taught, but it cannot be taught to a person who's only learned understanding. They have to have that capacity for relating item A to item B to item C, especially if items B and C are in a different field than item A. You have to be able to think, how does theology relate to history? And how does history relate to economics? I'm thinking especially of the Reformation. The Reformation would have been totally impossible if you hadn't had the economic development of the printing press, if you hadn't had the political conflict between the German states and the Pope. There is an interrelationship that has to be appreciated and has to be extrapolated in order to be able to think contextually, whether we're talking about the Reformation or whether we're talking about the second half of the 21st century. This is a quotation from Gatto, and I appreciate it because it is what is not taught in American schools, but would be necessary if you wanted to raise all of the children to be multidimensional.
I went to Jesuit boarding school in 3rd grade, so I'm between the ages of 7.5 and 8.5 years old, and the curriculum, reflecting back on it, which I first began to do 15, 20 years ago, the intellectual diet was not modified in any way for our tender years. And the devices of discipline and motivation that would be used in an authoritarian world, they were not chary of using, but I do believe that their hearts were in the right place. I remember being humiliated. I told you privately about this yesterday, by a Jesuit brother from St. Vincent's College, which is across the street from Xavier Academy, where I went and was beaten on a daily basis by the Ursuline nuns, sometimes for mispronouncing French there. But the brother was talking to us in the middle of the Second World War about the causes of the First World War, and he had written a list of causes on the board. I had a magnificent memory before drink intervened. And he said, could somebody face the back of the room now and tell us all the causes? And I, with my memory, I did, word for word. And he burst into a harsh kind of laughter, and he said, you fool, you believed me. He erased the board and said, these are the causes of the war. Now could you do it? And now, chastened, I did, a lot less confidently. And this time, the room exploded with his scorn. He did it again. He erased the board. He said, you will never know the causes until you embed yourself into the primary documents and see how complicated a thing this is. That changed my life. I only wish I might have had a second year there, but...
Before you can form your logical understanding, he said, you need to get in check with the knowledge, the actual grammar. What are the artifacts?
Yeah.
Where do these things documented? What's primary sources?
and it probably has occurred to other groups, but the intellectual part of the universal Christian religion, the Catholic Church, had a respect for scholarship. And what happens as you collect data is that it forms itself into patterns, and if you record the patterns and test them to see that they hold true, eventually that suggests behaviors. And so that they created two formulae, a basic formula which Dorothy Sayers, and I'd urge all your listeners to read her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. She's a marvelous detective story writer, and the detective stories really aren't genre stories. They're a comedy of manners about the British upper classes, but the trivium was becoming comfortable with a pattern of thinking in which you could dispel confusion. And then the quadrivium was pushing it farther into specialized areas. One of the huge mistakes that schooling makes, even homeschooling, is to organize the agenda and the goals in terms of subject learnings: English, math, social studies, science, because those categories, while better than chaos, are so crude they tend to mask what you're actually after. Take the universal study of the English language. What you're after is a mastery of the written language, the spoken language, and your own writing. So you've got these three divisions, and now if you're after those things, your measurement's not through memory, it's through performance, which is so much more accurate. As we spoke about a little earlier in this session, the standardized tests aren't predictive, and every first-class university knows that. You don't select people because they scored here on the SATs or whatever other tests are administered, because they end up disappointing you. And
the sum and substance of what I wanted to share with you this afternoon is that there are two educational systems exercised in the United States. One is intended and in large measure accomplishes the generation of critically thinking, analytically capable, articulate managers. Managers of politics, managers of industry, managers of international relationships. The other is intended to generate people who can fill relatively specific slots. That slot might be that of a physician, it might be that of a nuclear scientist, it might be that of a nurse, it might be that of a well-educated farmer. The well-educated farmer won't know anything about American history. He will know what he is told in the newspaper that he reads, and in the television set that he sits down, if a farmer has any time to sit in front of the television set. One group will be capable of turning off the television set because it disgusts them to be lied to. The other will change the channel. One group of persons will move along in the herd of sheep that is disgusted with being attacked and signs up to join the military after 9/11. And the other group, hopefully, a few, and these are probably not trained in either school, a few will say, you know, if A, B, and C happen, this is going to prove to be a false flag and is going to prove to be nonsense. Let me give you an example. Not with respect to 9/11, but with respect to the Kennedy assassination. There were two skeptically thinking individuals who, after Kennedy's assassination was announced, agreed that one of them was going to write a history of the event, and they agreed that if certain things happened, for example, if certain individuals were assigned to investigate, this would be a clear evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the perpetrator, that something else was going on. Well, it happened that Allen Dulles was assigned to the Warren Commission. And these two individuals, knowing the role that Allen Dulles had played in the CIA, that convinced them right off the bat that Kennedy's assassination was an inside job, that it was authorized from the highest levels of the deep state, and that Kennedy was going in a direction that was unacceptable. I'm not arguing that they were right or wrong. I am suggesting that they were capable of looking at the political situation and seeing the relationships between the CIA, the murder of John F. Kennedy, and certain things that were going on overseas, and knowing the relationship of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles to American foreign policy, to add up 2 and 2 and 2 and not get 5.5, but get 6. That's relational thinking. When I assert that the story that we are told about Las Vegas is false, not because I'm Nostradamus, no. I just know enough about the behavior of the American government to look at the simple thing. When we saw the corpse of the man who's reportedly perpetrated this crime, he should have been buried in empty cartridges. And the cartridges should have been soaked with his blood. The cartridges that were there were on top and were not bloodstained. And there weren't a lot of cartridges there. The physical evidence does not correspond with what your government and my government told us. For some reason, Matt Taibbi, and I think the reason is not because he's stupid, I think the reason is that he wants to maintain his job, chooses to ignore that kind of evidence. If you and I progressively learn how to evaluate the evidence, we can create a ripple effect, and your ripples will change the way other people think. Thank you for your attention.
When you mentioned Dorothy Sayer, okay,
right,
mysteries, it reminds me, in the last thing, either you mentioned it or it was in one of the videos. You look at when something happens, 9/11, a murder, whatever. You look at who benefits, and I love Agatha Christie. I mean, I just love her for entertainment. Always, they get down to who benefits. And so, you can look at any situation and forget all the other crap. Who benefits? You start a war in Serbia, who benefits? What minerals are they going to get? Who's going to benefit by that war? And you figure it out. I mean, those kind of things seem so basic.
It's one of the 3 basic rules that the detective: means, motive, who benefits, and opportunity. No matter, and using those 3, no matter how motivated you may be, if you don't have the opportunity, you didn't do it. But if you've got the means and the motive, you have to look for the opportunity, which is why when people are critically analyzing 9/11, they sometimes exclude the federal government entirely, and that's a mistake. The reason it's a mistake is there's no way the Mossad or any foreign government can recruit NORAD to fail at its job. And there was treasonous malfeasance and failure to perform duty along the entire chain of command of NORAD on that day. So some level of the federal government was involved. Obviously, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in this context. But because of the importance of secrecy, a whole lot of the mechanics of 9/11 had to be conducted outside the federal government, which is why even before we had more information, a Soviet analyst said this was performed with the assistance of a government, of a national government. And when you look at who benefited, it is the Zionists who benefited. Means more of an opportunity. But you have to be willing to ask that question instead of opening up the top of your head and letting Walter Cronkite or whoever the pretty face nowadays is. One of the tragedies of RT and Sputnik is that they are trying to accommodate to the American public to the extent of prostituting some of their programming. Some of their programming is anti-Russian. And I'm not talking about neutral Russian, it's actually anti-Russian, and that's unfortunate. But it's their way of attempting to ease their way into the American market. Which, in my opinion, people who want information are going to go to Sputnik and RT, and people who want to be entertained, in all probability are not. Because even the entertaining programs that I've seen on RT require human thought. Other comments? Dawn.
James Fetzer said that prior to 2013 there was a federal law that prohibited U.S. intelligence agencies from pulling the same kind of scams they were allowed to pull abroad. And that was just before Sandy Hook. So in his mind, almost nothing that has been reported in the media is true since then. And quite a few things before, but I hadn't heard that before. The law that they repealed was some name, MUD.
That may be true. I'm not familiar with that particular law, Dawn. But I will tell you, unfortunately, the deep state is immune. The deep state can and will do whatever its administrators decide to do. John F. Kennedy was the last one who wanted to rein in the deep state. And he did not have enough domestic support. He did not have the support of the Secret Service. The Secret Service could have prevented his assassination and did not. You listen to what the black Secret Service agent whom Kennedy recruited to be on his staff has to say, and L. Fletcher Prouty was sent to the South Pole for 3 weeks because Prouty would have organized Kennedy's protection and was not around to do so. That black officer was shunted out of the loop. You had the cooperation of state authorities, federal authorities, probably the mob, almost certainly part of the Mossad in that assassination. There were a lot of people who wanted Kennedy out of the way. I am grieved to say. And we're going to look more and more at the two different types of education next week. Because now we are getting into the meat of how you and I have been conditioned and brainwashed. You sent out a notice on brainwashing. I would suggest that it's appropriate to separate. Brainwashing involves what people think. Conditioning involves how people react to stimuli. They are very similar, but they're not identical. And if I can condition you to respond to an insult to the flag in a particular way, I don't really care what you think, because you're going to vote against the guy who is abusing your sacred flag. Or you're going to punch him in the gut. Something like that. Conditioning is equally important with the brainwashing. And I don't think we'll have time, and I don't have the expertise, but the various ways of conditioning people are very important. Hypnotism is a much stronger tool, and it is being used as an entertainment device. I suggested to one of my anesthesia colleagues, who's substantially younger than me, that he explore this, because it would be a very useful anesthetic technique. It has been used in a multitude of situations where chemical anesthesia was not available. But unfortunately, I've already acquired the reputation of being an unconventional thinker, so I don't think he explored it.